Dan Overbey, welcome to the Environmental Transformation Podcast.
Hey, Sean, it's good to be here.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad you get to come on to the show today. For the listeners, Dan Overbey is a LEED fellow. He's an assistant professor of architecture at Ball State University and the director of sustainability at Browning Day in Indianapolis. And his focus is on high performance building design and construction and environmental systems and research and green building certification services. Dan, thanks for coming on to the show today. I think we got a lot to cover with green buildings and environmental sustainability. So I'm looking forward to getting into this conversation with you today.
Yeah, likewise.
So Dan, tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey and your career path that led you to Browning Day and being an associate professor at Ball State.
Well, it's been an amazing journey that's taken me across several different states over the years. So I grew up in West Central Indiana, a Hoosier my whole life, but actually did my undergrad at Ball State. I was there for a few years, had an opportunity to study sustainability there, and I had some great teachers there that planted some really great seeds, really made me aware of some of the emerging imperatives with regard to environmental responsibility and looking at community engagement, human health. And I had some opportunities thereafter to go and work in Austin, Texas for a while at a great shop out there, the Center for Maximum Potential Building Systems with Plenty Fisk and Gilvatore. Learned a ton from them. Kept moving westward. I went to UNLV for my graduate work and had an opportunity to work in a research lab. And so while I was going to school out there and focusing on learning more about sustainability as it relates to architecture, I had a chance to work at Tate Snyder Kimsey, an architecture firm out there, apply what I was learning in school and what I was doing in a research environment and actually apply it to projects. And then the recession hit. That kicked me out of the Mojave Desert, and my wife and I decided to come back home again. And that's what brought us in early 2008 to Indianapolis. And I had an opportunity to work with one of my colleagues at the time and a predecessor to the director of sustainability role there, Bill Brown, who would later go on to be the first director of sustainability at IU and now has his own practice that focuses on sustainability. But got to work with him on a net zero energy library in Christney, Indiana. So Christney, Indiana is a town of about 500 people. It's south of Santa Claus, Indiana. So if any of your listeners have ever been to Holiday World, it's south of there by about a half hour. And the community had an opportunity to have their own library, but the head library for that branch said, you can have it, but we don't have an ability to staff it, and we have concerns about paying utility bills. And so they said, okay, we'll volunteer help from the community right next to the school, the elementary school there. And then they got some grants and got enough solar panels for the project. And we did enough with insulation and air tightness and being thoughtful about our windows that we were actually able to accomplish the first certified net zero energy project in Indiana. And since then, it's just been a wild ride. I've worked on a variety of projects that focus on green building, sustainability at various scales. And it's been wonderful to have an opportunity to go to my alma mater, Ball State, and now get to teach there and to be a building science educator and talk to my students about professional practice and try to impart to them some of the lessons I've learned along the way. So it's been a really, really fun journey.
Wow, that sounds like you've kind of, done a recycling of sorts there, starting here, going out, coming back, right?
That's
Wow,
right.
that's a really cool project, though. I bet that's been kind of a pinnacle type example project for some green building type projects that you can showcase over your career, right?
That was an important project for me personally. I learned a lot along that way. Along that same time, I was getting involved with our local chapter of the American Institute of Architects, and it's a nonprofit that represents the interest of our profession, and had a chance to advocate for legislation for the energy code back then, when the stimulus money was contingent on states updating their energy codes. And
Hmm.
I I learned even back then the power of just engagement at that level as well. And it was it just, yeah, the really the notion of being a citizen architect, of trying to help even outside of the office. And so, yeah, it's been fun to actually get to help with sustainability, not just in the office, not just in the classroom, but in the community in general.
Well, let's take a little detour here and kind of back up a bit and let the listeners kind of get a better feel for what is green buildings. I think a lot of us are thinking, well, what does that mean? And what all goes into it? And a lot of people may think, I know there's like the Energy Star, concept here when you buy appliances and things, but is that part of it? And so what is green buildings?
That's a wonderful question. And you could ask 10 different designers and get 10 different variations of that answer. If I were to synthesize it to its essence, I would say that a green building is a building that's designed to improve human and environmental impacts.
Mhm.
And why I say that, you could talk about environmental responsibility, you could talk about human health impacts, you could talk about a lot of different facets of this broader notion of sustainability. But the term that the design and construction industry is really latched onto is this notion of green buildings, those that are designed to improve human and environmental impacts.
Well, does that mean they're also using like recycled materials and things like that as part of the design in the green building?
It absolutely does. And what we'll talk with our clients about is to identify the uh, the values and the goals for the project, and
Hmm.
that might take us in a lot of different directions. Sometimes it's, and we like to do as much of this as possible, but
Hmm.
sometimes there's a rationale and a driver to really look at what, like the Christie Branch Library. They couldn't have a branch library if they didn't have net zero, if they couldn't basically eliminate their utility bill.
Hmm.
Sometimes stormwater, taking rainwater and trying to manage that in a thoughtful way is important. Sometimes it's how far can we go with recycled materials, looking at regional materials, looking at materials that took less resources and energy to make them and get them to your site. What happens after the time that we use a building is done? What would does it just get demolished and hauled away and basically, thrown onto a big heap and cover it up, or can we think about this in a different type of way and try to think through the entire life cycle and truly recycle the constituent parts of our buildings?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of getting into this. I don't know. It does it segue a bit into like the circular economy concept. I mean, I know IKEA is big on building furniture that, once you're done with the use of it, you send it back to IKEA and they break it back down and repurpose it and make new products. I mean, so is building materials in green buildings similar in that fashion where, you're going to, if a building's lasted, it's it's on its last leg, and you're going to redo it. Do you redo the product? You reuse the product, should I say?
That's another great question. And I would encourage your listeners, if they've not listened to your interview with Allison that you recently did, Allison Mitchell, that they would want to go back and listen to that, because she had some great input about the broader notions of the circular economy. Uh, if you think about it, and I'll tie it in here with buildings, the notion of waste is really a construct we've made for ourselves. It speaks to a
Yeah.
design problem.
Mhm.
If you look in nature, what's waste for one system becomes food input for another system. You
Mhm.
can see that with life cycles of plants and animals and food chains, that we have waste. And I use air quotes for that because we haven't designed through the end of the life of our building materials and our products. And we're now thinking about how we can start to, right now, try to minimize the waste, but eventually get to a point where we eliminate the concept of waste entirely. And
Mm.
that's going to require us to think of our buildings, like the IKEA example. uh, think about our buildings in ways, think ahead. What
Right.
happened? These buildings might last 60 years, they might last 600 years. You can see all over
Mm-hmm.
the world of buildings that live for different lengths of time, but
Right.
what happens at the end? Can we be thoughtful about designing them such that their parts either go back to nature
Mm-hmm.
or it goes back to, let's say, an industrial process, an
Right.
industrial metabolism where it can
To
be truly
reformalize
reused?
into another product.
Yes.
Yeah, right, right. Well, okay, so how do you evaluate whether or not a building is actually a green building? Like, are there metrics? Are there like key criteria here that you use to determine, hey, this building is like green?
There are a lot of different ways you can start to qualify a project as being green or not. And it will boil down to those goals for the project. But sometimes we see maybe some individuals take that into sort of an unsavory realm where you're trying to take advantage of the PR capital and such of saying that you have a green building when you really haven't done a whole lot. So do you call it a green building if you have maybe paint that doesn't off gas a whole lot, or you manage to surpass the energy code by just a little tiny amount? So what we've discovered as an industry, all of these things are good, but you really need something that's comprehensive, that doesn't have any major apparent blind spots, either intentional or unintentional, that
Mm-hmm.
we can
Mm-hmm.
start to prompt our design and construction teams to look at things in a holistic, well-rounded way, and not neglect certain issues. So whether it's water, energy, your site, your location, your materiality, as you were mentioning, the quality of your environments that you're creating. So we've come together as a collective, the building design and construction industry, so contractors, engineers, architects, other stakeholders, and we've defined over time a number of frameworks. And sometimes this will it'll take form as model building codes. Sometimes there'll
Mm-hmm.
be standards that you could
Mm-hmm.
adopt as a code if you want to. But then sometimes, if you really want to get into deep green building, deep sustainability, it might be something like the LEED rating system developed by the
Right.
U.S. Green Building Council. That stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, and it, as the acronym would suggest, it is going beyond code thresholds, beyond what you typically see, and try to address all those different qualities of green building in a holistic way. And if you do enough across all these different facets of sustainable design and construction,
Mm-hmm.
then you can get certified by this voluntary system. And there are other systems as well that focus, may have slightly different focuses to them. Some may focus on human health and wellness. Some may focus on active living, but this notion of a framework, of a rating system that gets certified. You
Mm-hmm.
mentioned Energy Star. That's a great one. That has to do specifically with energy. Just like your microwave can be Energy Star, your entire building can be Energy Star. And if it
Mm-hmm.
performs well enough with energy, you can get that certification. And that's another voluntary system that can help the industry do enough to sort of have a legitimate offering in terms of meeting the spirit of green
So
building.
So it sounds like most of these types of initiatives or design concepts are really voluntary at the moment. They're not like regulatory requirements within the building codes of things like that. It's more, hey, I'd like to do it because I want to do what's right for the environment or for you know our social responsibility type stuff, right? I mean, is that a fair statement?
That's a fair statement. See, what you're talking about here is the essence of what it means to have a green building. That by definition, you're talking about something that improves human and environmental impacts. So you look at where the codes put us, and the codes are basically saying, like, this is the minimum you need to do to be
Mm-hmm.
legal. So
Right.
if anything beyond that
Mm-hmm.
is going to be it's going to take some intentionality.
Mm-hmm.
And what it's doing is prompting our industry to be intentional and strive for certain outcomes in all these different qualities of green building, whatever they
Well,
may be.
so it sounds like, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but it sounds a little more expensive to design a system or a building in a green fashion. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's about the same. But is it? I mean, is that fair? I mean, is that true? Or maybe you tell us what your experience is.
I would say as an add-on, if you already had a building and now you needed to do additional things to it to meet
Hmm.
all of these different qualities, you could probably, if there's only take and no give, you could probably expect there to be a premium to it. So by definition, if you're going beyond what the code requires, that might imply that there's a premium. What we have found to a certain extent. I mean, all this is theoretical until you can get to specific buildings, specific budgets, specific goals, and specific strategies. But in
Hmm.
general, this concept of a multidisciplinary integrated approach to our design and construction projects, when you can set goals and stick to those steadfastly, when you can establish clearly what the budgetary constraints are and the time constraints, you can work together as a collective. If you're willing to have a give and take, that
Hmm.
maybe you won't have premium office finishes on your new office building. Maybe you're going to have something that's
Streamlined.
got a bit more of that industrial chic. We're seeing that's in
Sure.
style now anyway. But
Yeah. Right.
you may have to adjust your expectations for maybe some aspects of what you do in order to offset maybe the additional cost you would need for that premium glazing system,
Right.
for the solar panels that you may have. So if you're willing to do so, it doesn't have to be an ad. You could look at this thing in a comprehensive, integrative way where you strive for certain budgetary outcomes, and that keeps things very competitive. It just takes the creativity. It's a design
Hmm.
challenge. This is the
Sure.
architect in me. Constraints are opportunities and challenges, and when we have all those clear metrics up front, that's when, as a team, you bring in all the stakeholders and all the different disciplines. You can do some magical things, and it doesn't
Right.
have to cost you an arm and a leg to do so.
Well, so it sounds like to me though that the biggest opportunity to really do building design like this is in new construction. It sounds like to retrofit, older historic homes or buildings that have been around for a while, it's a little more of a challenge to achieve probably the green certification that it would be to have it kind of, designed into the whole system to work through these things. Is that would it be, kind of right? Statement? I
So
mean, that sounds about right? I don't know.
Well, I was just talking about this with one of my students. I'm advising for their thesis project because they're in the throes of considering new construction or some kind of retrofit situation for their final project.
Mhm.
And we had this very discussion about, oh, it's always easier when you have the blank canvas.
Right,
That
right,
when you have all these opportunities on the table with a new project, in a site that hasn't been disturbed, and it's just the world's your oyster, right? You can do all kinds of
right,
things,
right.
but there's, I think, a certain magic that comes through getting creative with constraints. And I will put another sort of consideration in play with existing buildings. See, as the if you look at the entire building stock that we have in just our industry, and we're doing, I think, like quarterly hundreds of billions of dollars worth of gross domestic product. I mean, construction, design and construction, a huge segment of our economy.
Mhm.
And when we talk about trying to offset let's say, the environmental uh, detriment of massive amounts of carbon contributions to the atmosphere,
Mhm.
and you look at what the building sector contributes toward that, which is a huge piece of the pie, that the best way we can start to mitigate that proportionate contribution to the carbon emissions would be to rehabilitate our existing building stock. That
Yeah, you would
most of the
have
buildings
to.
we're going to have, that's the
Yeah,
only,
right. You're
we
not
can
gonna
do
tear them
these nice
down, right,
shiny, no, you have these
right.
shiny, nice, great emblematic green buildings, but we really need to figure out existing buildings. That there's so much that goes into the concrete and the steel with all of that which is already standing. If we can find a way
Mhm.
to rehabilitate our existing building stock, and give it another life, a second, a third, a fourth life.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
does wonders. Not to mention that there's a certain spirit in our our building fabric around us and preserving that and celebrating that and working with that.
Well, I'm kind of an old guy in the sense that I used to watch a lot of This Old House. Yeah, you ever watch This Old House? That show
Absolutely.
on
I love
PBS,
that
and
show.
so yeah, and I think they do a really nice job of inserting a lot of green rehabilitation techniques and procedures into rehabbing old homes to make them more energy efficient, which is the kind of the goal of these green buildings, right? I mean, they put in solar, they do a better job of LED lighting and things like that. I mean, that's, I think,
It was,
part of that whole concept, right?
you're right. And it's funny you mentioned This Old House. Growing up, I used to watch that show with my dad, and then they had a spinoff called This New House that I really latched onto. And now, when I say go take the kids and go over and we see Grandpa and we'll watch this together, they've really pulled This New House into This Old House. To your point, it's
Hmm.
they still have the old name, but it's really just this house.
Yeah.
It all comes together now. It's all
Right.
we're looking at how we take these existing buildings and we take these innovative new technologies and methods, and you can do things now that were not possible 10, 20 years ago. There's been this emerging emphasis on being wiser with how we approach building science and how we
Hmm.
look at energy efficiency and managing condensation and how vapor moves through and air tightness. And because you can go extremely airtight and then you have to be really careful about how you ventilate. And
Hmm.
I like it now that you're totally right. The discourse, let's call it, on green building has really taken now this sort of it's brought existing buildings, residential, commercial, and otherwise, into this center stage where I think it's not just a matter of the environmental virtues of it, but there's this spirituality in our buildings when we can
Hmm.
preserve them and
Hmm.
celebrate them. And it's what gives our communities their unique character and
Yeah.
gives us that linkage to the heritage of a location. And then off of sustainability, you start to pull in local resources. And a really deep sustainable design, a green building in Indianapolis shouldn't look like the green building in Santa Fe, and vice versa. They should really embody the spirit of their
Yeah.
locality.
Yeah.
And so
Right.
it's
No, I
a
love
beautiful
that.
point that you touched on there.
Well, okay, so w- I, I was kind of doing a little research on the green building topic. Apparently, it sounds like there's some financial incentives for individuals and developers to incorporate green building designs in their projects. How does that work? I think it's like the mortgage incentive program or something, the MIP. I mean, it sounds to me like there are some tax incentives to really incorporate these things into your program to help you, kind of get over the hump.
That's right. There are a range of incentives that will apply differently on different types of projects, and the Green MIP reduction program is a great one. That's one that we've recently worked with. If you have certain kinds of HUD lending, you can qualify for implementing green building practices.
Hmm.
You have a range of different, we talked about these voluntary rating systems. It might be the National Green Building Standard, it could be Passive House, it could be LEED, it could be any number of these systems. But you take one of these rating systems, you commit to it, you start to work on it, and now you can start to take your uh, mortgage interest premium and start to reduce that. That there starts to be some incentives in the marketplace that can help with that. You'll see in different municipalities. I would say for anybody looking to pursue green building, that you look at your utility, your municipality, you look statewide, you look federally, and see what you can take advantage of, because there's a lot of ways to try to entice that value proposition. There's some incentives that
Sure.
are out there right now on the table, and it's some come and go. You could look at some of the federal tax incentives that were out there that have changed over time, and it's a bit of a moving target. What was true maybe 2 years ago wasn't necessarily true now, but it does change that. So you take we've had this conversation a lot just in green building circles when we work with clients and prospective clients about the opportunity to put solar on a project. We just
Yeah.
did this with the Indianapolis Public Library with their Eagle branch, and we were able to reduce their energy cost by just a hair over 80% by getting solar on the roof of that project. And it's the cost of some of these technologies are becoming very, very attractive at this point.
Could you
We've
imagine?
seen,
Could you imagine if all the residential property owners were incentivized enough to, add solar to their properties, into their homes, their roof systems? How much energy could we put back into the grid, reduce their consumption of, fossil fuels,
absolutely.
natural gas, whatever, right? Oh my gosh. And I certainly have looked into it myself, but again, it's that cost differential thing. It's like, wow, okay, right now it just doesn't seem attainable or realistic to spend that much money to put on a solar panel on top of your roof right now. If we can solve that, I think we're gonna see a huge transition in our country with people pursuing solar as an alternative, renewable energy.
Well, and I'll add that there's a great book, The Ecology of Commerce, one of my favorite books from, it was written back in the 90s, Paul Hawkins, and it talks about, it has a couple of tenets of that book talking about sustainability and
Hmm.
how you interface with the market. And he makes the point that when you can make something, you can have an offering in the marketplace that's more attractive than the other options that are available now, then market mechanisms start to play
Drive it.
itself out and starts to
Hmm.
drive it. So
Hmm.
right now, some of your listeners might be listening to this while they're working, might be working from home right now, but back when we were all working in offices, it may be that you had your waste receptacle and you had your blue bin right next to it. And
Hmm.
maybe the contracted services were such that the waste, because waste could have lunch scraps and nasty stuff in it, that gets carried out by somebody every evening. Whereas your recycle bin, you had to walk down the hall and around the corner and put it in the recycle collection location. And you know what? It's easier just to throw it in the other bin and it just magically goes
Yeah,
away when I
that
go home at
happens.
night.
Yeah, yeah.
If you look at solar, when we get to that point where the installed cost, and then the changing rate of our energy with our local utility, at some point you reach this tipping point where it actually becomes more economically viable to use the solar. And when that happens, when we reach that tipping point, then the market starts to drive that. So if we can understand when it's more convenient for people, when there are the market mechanisms that are starting to drive it, that's when
Right.
you'll see this transformative change start to happen.
Well, it seems like there's a lot of issues in play here as it relates to the environment, energy, water, some health. You know, what are some of the concepts that have a better economic yield than others for green buildings?
Energy will be the one that I could make the clearest economic case for you, that if we make our buildings airtight, we add the proper amounts of insulation, we
Hmm.
might be able to fold in some on-site renewables, maybe not, but there's going to be a payback in what you save from an operational cost standpoint, the energy cost
Hmm.
savings, et cetera. On the other hand, if you were to take a commercial office building, I think it
Hmm.
was the University of Illinois did the study recently, and they showed if you just take cumulative cost to the business for having a standalone commercial office building, I forget all the qualifiers to the project, but it was a commercial office building over 30 years. They looked at the total cumulative cost and the construction and everything that went into that, all the
Hmm.
initial cost to build the building being about 2%, all the operational costs of various sorts being about 6%. That means the remaining 92%, it was all the people cost.
Ah.
It's all the cost of the people working for the company and everything that folds into that. So if you could, over the lifetime of that building, create a better quality environment, uh, more fresh air intake, healthier materials that aren't off gassing, uh, if you could offer up more views to nature, if you could bring in daylight, thermal controls, let people just feel like they have more controllability of their space. When you can do these things, we are seeing an emerging body of research now showing that there are tremendous health implications of doing that. If you could just increase worker productivity by just a small increment, maybe like 5%, lower absenteeism by 5%. If you could retain some talent because of the environments that you can work
Hmm.
in,
Yeah.
those start to pay dividends. Imagine over the lifetime of the building now, that 90 plus percentage of the pie,
Oh, yeah.
you've just paid for your building a couple times over during its lifetime by creating better environments that
Environments for your workers.
elevate
Yeah.
workers, elevate the human condition.
That's excellent. Well, so we've been talking about the green building concepts, but there are these specific codes and procedures and practices of trying to achieve green building, and I guess it's called LEEDs, right? LEEDs is the rating system that's out there. Talk a little bit about how that got started, if you could, and give the listeners a little bit of kind of clarity on what LEEDs are, what the LEED system is, because maybe some of us have walked by a building and seen a little plaque on the side of the building that says this is a LEED approved building or some sort. And there's different levels, right? So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely, I'd love to. So the acronym stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. It's one of those voluntary rating systems developed in the late 90s, and it's continued to advance over time. It was created by and continues to be adjusted by the U.S. Green Building Council, which is based out of Washington, D.C. It's a 501c3 charitable nonprofit. It is, when people hear U.S. Green Building Council or USGBC, and
Mm-hmm.
it's in DC, people start to think it's like the US DOE or the US EPA, like, oh, it's some government body. It's not. It's a standalone nonprofit.
Okay.
And they brought this offering to the marketplace to address, back at the time, this desire to have some kind of comprehensive framework so that, again, people don't have these blind spots with how they approach green building. If you
Mm-hmm.
want to look at some of the untoward activities of those who might even try to misrepresent themselves in the marketplace, we call that
Mm-hmm.
greenwashing,
Yeah.
and you can see that in consumer the consumer market a lot. So they came up with this rating system. It has a lot of credits in it, and these credits are optional. There's a few what they call prerequisites, a few things that you must do. You must reach a certain threshold of energy performance. You must
Gotcha.
reach a certain threshold of ventilation. You must reach a certain threshold of water, etc. But
Mm-hmm.
then there's this variety, this range of different credits you can take on as a project team or not. And
Mm-hmm.
then within those, there are different thresholds you can hit. And they will look at the location of your project. They'll look at sustainable site development, water efficiency, energy issues, materiality. They'll look at the indoor environmental quality. And then there's also some extra points you can get for being innovative and doing things that they've identified as being regionally more important. And so it's become 110 points in total that are theoretically available for a project. You are not going to get all 110 points. In fact, many of your projects could struggle to get 40 or 50 points
Oh, really? So
because
it's kind
some
of
of
hard.
those,
It's challenging to get there. But
it
like
is
the threshold to
challenging.
at least be considered green is like at 40 points or something like or whatever the
That's
minimum
absolutely
is, right?
correct. Yep.
Okay.
40 is basic certification, then 50 is silver, and then 60 is gold. And then if you get up to 80, that's platinum. That's the highest you can go, is 80
Ah,
out of 110.
okay.
And if you can get to that point, that's the upper tier. And that means you're doing not just dabbling in all those categories I just
Right.
mentioned, but you're actually doing a lot of things within each of those categories.
So, are you finding a lot of corporate companies are really seeking out to design buildings at that platinum level? Because I mean, that's the pinnacle, right? I mean, that's the one everybody wants to. Well, maybe everybody wants, but that's the one you'd want to go for, right?
If you go for LEED, if you're uh, attracted to pursue LEED certification aspirationally, you'll always look up the mountain and see platinum and wonder what it's going to take to get there.
Right.
And that's kind of a natural part of the process, is to see how high can you reach.
Mm-hmm.
And what's really interesting about these rating systems, so they draw a line in the sand. And
Mm-hmm.
if you're going to come up with this very specific definition of intent for these credits and things you have to do, you're invariably on any project team going to have that day where you're talking about, oh, we need to get to 16% energy savings and we're at 15.9. How do we get there? And I can't believe we're going to get denied credit for all these things we've done, or bike racks, and oh, it's not connected to a publicly accessible network that has 10 different uses. You can get into like
The
this
weeds there a little bit.
leadopoly where it's just
Yeah.
like this nuance, and
Uh,
it's just it's frustrating at times. But I'll also say, Sean, it also, as frustrating as it can be on some days, on other days, when you commit steadfast to LEED certification on projects, it will create for your project teams the ability to have leverage to bring into consideration and discussion things that otherwise you could
you
just
wouldn't
cut
think of.
corners on, and just,
Right.
or just maybe you could either not think of it and have a blind spot, or you say, this is good enough here. We'll go ahead and not do this more challenging thing that could be very virtuous and helpful on a project, but it's gonna, it's gonna be wrought with some coordination complications, or maybe have some cost increases, even if it does a lot of great good. This is the point I'm trying to make, is under the uh, under the pressures of budgetary constraints, of schedule
Mm-hmm.
constraints, of resources and coordination, and taking advantage of certain opportunities, you'll always have these frustrating days because of the line in the sand about getting to the other side of the line, or wherever you need to arrive on your specific project. And as frustrating as it can be on certain days, it has saved projects on certain days
Well,
because I'm able to have a discussion that otherwise you could just cut corners around.
Well, I imagine though, under those kind of constraints, though, it does provide kind of a whole new avenue of creativity to try to get there. Like, it's a challenge, right? It's like the designers and the architects are trying to understand, well, how can we do something, within the guidelines of this green concept that's outside the box, right? So doesn't that
It does.
just excite you guys to really think outside the box?
It's what I love to do the most, is
Mm-hmm.
looking at, and not just LEED, but a lot of these rating systems are becoming, as our market, as just collectively we're having more sophisticated tools and having richer dialogue about the things that we're doing, and we're understanding the impacts of our buildings better and the solutions we have available, is we are starting to be a lot more sophisticated with how we approach this stuff. And we're shifting from a decade or so ago, talking about designing with really great intents, toward verified performance outcomes. And there
Mm-hmm.
was a period of time during this transition, this long-term transition from designing with the best of intentions to verified performance outcomes, that we were seeing some disjointedness. There were some studies coming out that would say, well, you got this project that's certified to this rating system, and then you look at their modeled performance, then you look at how it's actually performing, and there's this big difference. And that's, by the way, it has to do with how your project team put together the model. It has nothing to do really with the rating system. They just said model how the building's going to perform. That just means you
Mm-hmm.
made some bad assumptions. Maybe you made good assumptions, but underestimated just how popular your brand spanking new
Mm.
LEED or well project is, and how much people are going to desire to be in this thing, and it's being used in ways that you didn't anticipate because it's such a
Mhm.
great space. There's
Yeah.
so many factors, but we're now getting to this point where we're looking at actual performance. That's really what it boils down to now, is how is it actually performing? And I love to get into these performance modeling exercises, and every once in a while you'll discover something. Sometimes you'll have a hypothesis and you'll just get nailed right between the eyes with something you didn't expect, that
Yeah.
you something that you thought would happen and it didn't, and you're checking your numbers. And sometimes you'll find these synergies where if you do something on a project, it might actually help across several different facets of green building. I'm thinking of something like maybe a a green roof that's increasing biodiversity on site and maybe making your roof protected, and it's going to help sequester stormwater and buffer out some energy exchange there, and it's going to do a variety of different things, maybe create an outdoor space that people can enjoy. There are several things right there off the top of my head by having certain types of something like
Wow.
a green roof, certain types of strategies.
Well, so these leads, systems and ratings and evaluations to kind of certified. I mean, I can't imagine the normal building, inspector, the local county building inspector is the guy who comes out and does the lead verification. Is he, or is he the same guy, or is this, you got to have a trained inspector to come out and do this type of certification?
So when it comes to the inspection side of things, it will be so the building inspector will look at, did you meet your local building code, your
Codes.
local energy code. When it gets to something like LEED, you might think, could it be the building inspector? It's not that person. Could it be the U.S. Green Building Council? It wouldn't be them. They would have a conflict. They, of course, want you to pass. So there's been established this third party, the certification body, the
Okay.
GBCI, and they're also based out of DC. And the GBCI will, and whether it's LEED or it's WELL or it's the Sustainable Sites Initiative, they will, as a separate third party, look at the project documentation and
Audit
put
it
it
and
through
verify it.
through the scrutiny
Yeah.
of that review, and
Gotcha.
you'll get pushback on things. It's again, some days a process that's more frustrating than others, but
They be nitpicky.
I appreciate the nitpickiness because it's upholding that standard. It's upholding
Right.
the integrity of the system, and you have to have that. And that's why, Sean, you'll get into these discussions about LEED equivalent on project. Well, we'll build it to the LEED standard, but we won't go through the
The
certification
certification. It's
system.
yeah. Yeah.
And
That sounds
I've
like EMS for us in the environmental world. Oh, we want to have an EMS program, but we're not going to certify.
it's like, I'm going to file my taxes, but the IRS isn't going to look at it. It's like it's just what you're asking for here is, and we've run the cost, by the way. If you look at all the soft cost on a project, so all
Mhm.
the modeling and the commissioning and the daylight assessment, just all these different things you can do, getting that plaque on the wall is sometimes less than 2%, almost always less than 4% of those soft costs. I mean, you're
Sure.
really talking a little
Small amount.
sliver of the
Mhm.
total pie of what it takes to
Right.
do that. It's like you're going to go all the way to 96%, 98%, and then stop.
Right.
And what you gain in that last couple of percent of cost is the rigor of that third party scrutiny, and making
Yeah.
sure that as a building owner, let's say, that you
Your
get
design outcome, yeah, your
what you
design
think you're
outcome
paying
met it.
for.
Right, right. No, I think that's fantastic. So there's independent certifying bodies and probably trained and certified inspectors and evaluators that come out and do that. That's great. So, man, we've been unpacking a ton of stuff here. One little last thing, a question I'd like to hit on real quick before we kind of start the wrap up here, but I have seen some of these live buildings. Have you seen these live buildings that have like trees and plants growing off of them all the way up to like the 10th floor?
Oh
That's
yeah.
been designed into their structure. I mean, I think those are really fascinating. What's your take on those? Have you been involved in designing any of those?
We've been involved in, we call those verdant surfaces. And because it could be a roof, it could be a wall, it could be any variety of landscape that you do, that you may
Mm-hmm.
have a structure underneath it. It can take so many different forms. And there are certainly some maintenance considerations. You'll have to be in store for that. It's always interesting whenever you have any of these types of vegetated surfaces with buildings like this, that it's not like a shingled roof. You're going to have to, it's more like a garden. And
Right, right.
you don't just grow a vegetable garden and then leave it to sort of fend for itself. You go out there and you take care of it. It's a real living thing.
I
And
imagine you've got irrigation designed in this thing, right? I
you
mean, you
absolutely
have to.
can.
Stormwater from your roof and stuff probably incorporated
You can
into it.
more synergies and opportunities that can happen if you bring everybody together early and you figure out how you're going to do this the right way. And why do we want to do this? There's a number of virtues to it. Again, more synergies you can strike. You're increasing biodiversity on your site. You are maybe buffering out how energy travels through your envelope. Also, this notion of biophilia, that people have this this sort of hardwired innate affinity toward connections with nature, that
Mm-hmm.
when you have views of nature, and we can accomplish this even in a dense urban environment. This is why Central Park in Manhattan is so popular. It's when you can see and connect and be in nature in some way. There's lots of different ways you can connect with
Stress
nature.
reliever.
It has
Big
so
time, right?
many physiological benefits, so many.
Right. Well, that's good. So, are there any of those types of projects in the Midwest that are kind of noteworthy, or are most of them more in different type of climate areas that are more effective?
The climate, that's a very astute point. The climate can make a big impact. We actually have a climate that can be conducive to that. I would say, depending on what you're looking for, some of these more wild representations of these live buildings.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking of some of the work of like a famous architect like Ken Yang, that has done some of the stuff. There's some all over the world. There's a spectrum, and so I would say that there are some projects that are nearby that you could look to, that you sometimes it's apparent. You can
Mm-hmm.
see some of these verdant surfaces on projects. I think
Mm-hmm.
about the projects like the Eli Lilly. They have some green roofs there. WFYI has a really nice, luscious green roof on their structure.
Mm-hmm.
You can. I'm thinking of there's a couple of different projects that have these kind of surfaces, and it's there's just a certain delight with it. I'm even thinking of an indoor green wall we did for the
Yeah,
citywide YMCA. That it's there's just this connection with nature. How much we benefit from that. These
yeah.
real living
Plants. Yeah, that's great.
plants and the connections we have. It really speaks to getting beyond all this geeky performance stuff we're talking about. There's also, when we talked about the spirituality of the materials and the buildings around us, plants are a part of that, and we're hardwired to have joy when we can connect
That's
with
right.
nature.
That's right.
And it's when you can do that, it's a really wonderful thing.
Well, so this has been a great show, Dan, and I really appreciate you coming on. If I was a student in your class, I think I'd be pretty stoked to have you as a professor. Give us a little
Sean,
talk,
you can
just
audit
a.
my class anytime.
I'd love to come up there one night and just kind of sit in
Don't
and
tempt me, we'll make it
yeah.
happen.
All right. That sounds great. I mean, that'd be great. I'm sure that your students would love to probably hear your podcast too, hear your show on this one, and learn some stuff. I mean, I think they're all kind of seeking to learn about green buildings, the LEED certification process. I mean, we haven't gone through everything, and there's a lot more to cover on this topic, obviously, but this has been great. I really appreciate you coming on. Real quick, some little interesting facts, takeaways. What are some of your hobbies outside of work and outside of normal, professor teaching activities you do?
Well, outside of work, if I mentioned this old house, I have an older house that I am always working on. It's a
That's
bit
the
of a
money pit,
laboratory
man.
for
That's
me.
that's what I've got one of those too.
My wife likes it when I can refer to it as a laboratory,
A
sort of living
laboratory.
lab, as opposed to a
Hmm.
money pit. But it's both, and
Yeah, yeah,
so I've got things metered out, some constant things I'm trying to improve, and it gives me that sort of tactile outlet as an architect to get my hands into some things and try
yeah.
some experiment a little bit. But
Life application.
that's right. And then I've got a wife, and I've got a son, a daughter. I love spending time with them. I do a lot of writing off to the side. That's a creative outlet for me. I love
Sure.
to think, read, and write every month. And yeah, and then I do some graphic design. One of the things that my students eventually learn about me and they think is interesting is I'll do some graphic design off to the side once in a while. Here's what the thing about architects, Sean, is I think I have this theory that we all have to have a creative outlet in addition to architecture.
Hmm.
That whether it's playing an instrument, I know some architects that are in bands and will do that kind of stuff for the weekend. And for me, it's maybe for one of those bands working on maybe a single cover for a new song that they're doing or something. And I've found over time that architects like to have some more than one creative outlet. So I enjoy that from time to time as well.
Oh, that's great. That's good. Well, this has been great. Dan, I know you've been nominated by the Indiana Recycling Coalition as like one of those top 30 leaders in the industry here locally too. That was quite an honor that
That
they
was quite an
bestowed
honor.
upon you.
Thank you for
Congrats on
mentioning that.
that. Thank you
Thank you.
for, and for helping out the IRC. I know Allison and the crew there and local Indianapolis loves to have you contribute and support. So, but hey, good talk today. Looking forward to catching up with you down the road, and we'll do it again sometime. And maybe you'll come up with some other really cool, innovative topic that you want to bring on the show about the architecture world that you're living in right now.
Thanks, Sean. This is quite an honor to be here, and I would be more than happy to come back anytime or point you to some friends to talk about some aspects of this entire world of topical matter. Just let me know how I can help elevate what you're doing. I
Absolutely.
think this is a
Yes.
wonderful platform here.
Really appreciate it, and look forward to staying in touch with you. And yep, let's get it out on social media. Let's get it out to the masses, and let's spread the word.
Let's do
Green
it.
buildings. Yeah. All right. Thanks, buddy.
Thanks, Sean.
All right. Bye bye.